I think the important thing, Samantha, is simply not to take seriously what the Russian government or the Assad government is saying right now. We need to look behind their words. The Russian government is actually relieved that this is as far as this strike went. And this is probably the end of it. Trump really doesn't want to get deeper into Syria. In fact, he wants to leave.
Russia had urged the US not to attack and said it would shoot down any missiles. The OPCW, the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog, has a team in Syria right now, due to begin investigating this weekend. But Western military strikes have come first, after the UK, America and France pledged that Syria's use of chemical weapons must not go unpunished. Andrew Plant, BBC News.
Well, our Middle East correspondent Martin Patience joins us live now from Beirut. Martin, welcome to you. I just want to bring you and our viewers this breaking line coming into us via the AFP news agency. And this is reaction from Iran, of course, a key regional player and itself involved in the Syria conflict, warning of regional consequences following those strikes by the US, saying the United States and its allies have no proof and without even waiting for the Organisation for the Protection of Chemical Weapons to take a position, have carried out this military attack and are responsible for the regional consequences. That's from the Foreign Ministry spokesperson there, and this is on the Telegram channel in Iran. So fairly strong words coming from Tehran today.
Strong words from Iran, strong words from the Syrian government. They've come out to denounce these Western strikes, which they deem as illegal and, in their words, are doomed to fail. I think we're used to this. We had sound and fury leading up to these Western airstrikes. Some said that if the military action matched the rhetoric, then it would be very serious indeed. But what it appears that we've seen today is very closely targeted air and missile strikes on targets in Damascus as well as the city of Homs. According to the Americans, they've been targeting the infrastructure and storage of chemical weapons facilities. We're hearing from the Syrian government no word on casualties, although they said in one incident 3 civilians were injured. But I think that underscores that most of these targets apparently were empty, and it shows that the Western governments, yes, they may be denounced. Yes, the Syrian government, along with its backers, Russia and Iran, didn't want this to happen. But it does appear that the Western governments have been very careful not to target military bases, for example, that contained Russian or Iranian soldiers. The big fear being that would ratchet up tensions and perhaps lead to conflict across the region. For now, yes, we're hearing rhetoric, we're hearing verbal reaction, but no military reaction.
Yeah, it is just hours since these strikes took place. And as you say, daylight now in many countries as we wait for governments to wake up and respond. We've also heard from President Trump when he made that announcement that this may not be the last we see in terms of military action in a response to that chemical attack or suspected chemical attack in Douma.
That was from President Trump, but there appears to be splits or mixed messaging within the administration. His defense secretary said this was a one-time shot. So again, it doesn't appear that the White House is on the same page. Certainly this was a bigger strike than we saw last year. Double number of missiles were used, for example. It hit more targets, but I don't think it was on the scale that some were perhaps expecting and some were perhaps fearing. There was talk, for example, of taking out the delivery systems of these alleged chemical weapons that were used last week. That would have involved taking out the Syrian Air Force, but we know that the Syrian planes have been moved to a Russian base. And again, clearly, what Western leaders have been stressing is they want to warn President Assad over the red line of using chemical weapons, but what they didn't want to do was spark a bigger confrontation, particularly between America and Russia on the ground. And for now, they appear to have achieved that objective.
OK, Martin Patience in Beirut for now. Thank you. Let's just show you these live pictures coming in from France, where we are seeing a news conference there because, of course, France has been involved in this military action. We've heard earlier from President Macron saying in a statement that a red line had been crossed and France could not tolerate the normalisation of the use of chemical weapons. Well, we're hearing now from the French Foreign Minister and Defence Minister speaking on those Syria strikes. They are speaking in French. We are monitoring what they're saying and getting a translation, and as soon as we get that, we will bring it to you. In the meantime, Russia has given its first response to these attacks. Anatoly Antonov, ambassador to the US, issued a statement saying the worst apprehensions have come true. Our warnings have been left unheard. Again, we are being threatened. We warned that such actions will not be left without consequences. All responsibility for them rests with Washington, London and Paris. Insulting the president of Russia is unacceptable and inadmissible. The US, the possessor of the biggest arsenal of chemical weapons, has no moral right to blame other countries. Let's go to Moscow and speak to our correspondent, Jonah Fisher. And again, strong words from Russia, as you would have expected, Jonah.
Yeah, pretty strong words from the Russians, both in the United States, that ambassador there, and also from the foreign ministry here in Moscow. The spokesperson here posting on Facebook just a short while ago. Those behind this claim moral leadership in the world and declare they are exceptional. You really need to be exceptional to shell Syria's capital at the moment when it has gained a chance at a peaceful future. We've also had confirmation from the Ministry of Defense here that effectively Russian assets in Syria, there's a Russian military base, a Russian naval base, that they have not been affected in any way, that the missiles did not go into those parts of Syria. So the worst fears of many people that this might lead to some sort of confrontation, that Russia might perhaps shoot down an American missile, that we might see a clash actually between those two militaries when the strike took place. Those haven't been realised. So some pretty tough words being said this morning. I think, as Martin said there will be a degree of relief as well that there hasn't been a direct touching between the two militaries of the United States and Russia. We'll just have to see as the day progresses what the full reaction is of the government here.
All right, Jonah Fisher in Moscow for now. Thank you. Well, a short time ago, the US Defense Secretary Jim Mattis spoke to the press about the operation.
Earlier today, President Trump directed the U.S. military to conduct operations in consonance with our allies to destroy the Syrian regime's chemical weapons research, development, and production capability. Tonight, France, the United Kingdom, and the United States took decisive action to strike the Syrian chemical weapons infrastructure. Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. The 70 nations in the Defeat ISIS coalition remain committed to defeating ISIS in Syria. The strike tonight separately demonstrates international resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used on anyone under any circumstance in contravention of international law. I want to emphasize that these strikes are directed at the Syrian regime. In conducting these strikes, we have gone to great lengths to avoid civilian and foreign casualties. But it is a time for all civilized nations to urgently unite in ending the Syrian civil war by supporting the United Nations-backed Geneva peace process. In accordance with the Chemical Weapons Convention prohibiting the use of such weapons, we urge responsible nations to condemn the Assad regime and to join us in our firm resolve to prevent chemical weapons from being used again.
US Defence Secretary there. Let's go to Chris Buckler in Washington for the latest from there now. Chris, welcome to you. We were, of course, expecting some kind of response to this suspected chemical attack in Syria last week. But could we have expected more? Is this a somewhat limited response from President Trump, do you think?
Yeah, there has been an ongoing debate, we know, inside the administration about just what the level and severity and sustained nature of these strikes should be. And certainly this is a very brief bombing campaign. It's worth reflecting that President Trump went on air in television to say that the missiles were starting to be sent into Syria. And within an hour, we had that Pentagon briefing saying that the bombing campaign was over. So it was very brief indeed. But what it has done is it has been trying to send a message, not just to President Assad, but also to his allies, Iran and Russia. And in that, it has been extremely targeted. It has focused on chemical facilities, those places where weapons are being stored, and also labs where they're being developed. And perhaps that is an indication that those within the administration who felt that this could lead to some kind of more difficult relationship with Russia, that threat of retaliation was always hanging in the air, perhaps they won. Certainly there are some reports here that President Trump had hoped for something aggressive. And although this is brief, it is aggressive, but it is perhaps not as much as he talked about initially, certainly whenever he was sending out those tweets talking about smart, shiny missiles.
Chris, within the past 15 minutes, we've had a reaction from Iran warning of regional consequences following these strikes. How concerned do you think the White House will be by this language?
Yeah, Russia also talking of consequences as well, which Washington, London and Paris must bear responsibility for, in their words. Iran talking of regional consequences, and I think that does reflect that there are some asking a wider question about this. And that is not just about the purpose of these strikes, which is to send a message, is to send a deterrent, but also a question to France, the US and the UK about what their wider strategy is about the region. Clearly, President Assad is there. Theresa May, the British Prime Minister, made a specific point of saying this is not about regime change. However, Syria is a country that is completely mired in conflict. And there is a question about exactly what those countries aim to do to try and address that and deal with those problems beyond simply sending missiles in. So I think we have seen the strikes. The question is, do we know the strategy?
Yeah, also questions about the OPCW, the international body who've been sent in to investigate whether or not this was a chemical attack. Questions now about whether they'll be able to operate and conduct their investigations following these airstrikes.
Yeah, and of course they knew that they were intending to start work today, on the day that these missiles have struck inside Syria. I think there are two things to say about that. First of all, there has been a long discussion about exactly what the response would be. And there are some, certainly on the UK and French side and within the administration here in Washington, who have felt very clearly that there needed to be something that was done quickly. And so they have acted quickly. But the Office for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons is going in there. Their experts are going to try and assess exactly what happened in Douma. In some respects, that is deeply important because it backs up, if they come out with results that say chemical weapons were used, it backs up the reasons that the US, the UK and France had for these strikes, particularly as Russia continues to push this narrative that it was a fabricated story. However, it is clear already that Russia will not necessarily accept the findings of the OPCW. And therefore, does it really matter? I'm not entirely sure. But certainly in the longer term, trying to assess whether chemical weapons are used and where they are being stored in Syria, those are things that are very important, particularly as this conflict develops.
OK, Chris Buckler in Washington for now. Thank you. Let's get more on the Russia reaction and talk to Steve Fish, who's a politics professor at the University of California, Berkeley, specialising in Russian and US politics. He's live from San Francisco now. Thanks very much for talking to us here on BBC World News. What's your reaction to Moscow's reaction? They are, as we heard from Chris there, trying to say that this is all a plan to discredit the work of the OPCW, who won't be able to get to work now today as planned.
I think the important thing, Samantha, is simply not to take seriously what the Russian government or the Assad government is saying right now. We need to look behind their words. The Russian government is actually relieved that this is as far as this strike went. And this is probably the end of it. Trump really doesn't want to get deeper into Syria. In fact, he wants to leave. And the British and French wanted to deliver this blow as a kind of symbolic reaction to what Assad did, They have deep interest in the country. All Western powers have said the use of chemical weapons is not acceptable, and yet the Western powers have put together what really looks like just a kind of symbolic response. It did no major damage to Syrian forces. It didn't come near Russian forces. I think the Russians are relieved about this.
They've obviously said that, as you could expect, the rhetoric is ramping up, but, they are angry about this. What do you expect them to do in response, if anything?
Nothing. I don't think they're going to do all that much. They're happy with the way this has worked out. Clearly, the Western alliance does not want war with Russia. Russia certainly doesn't want war with the West. Of course, rhetorically, publicly, they have to act indignant. People will do that on all sides. At the same time, though, I don't think we can really expect much reaction from Russia beyond, again, just rhetorical reaction and face-saving actions.
In that case, what's the point of these strikes? If you think there's going to be little reaction from Russia and it's not going to change the strategy of the Syrian government, what's the point?
That's a good question, and it's not one we're going to get to the bottom of by listening to formal statements. Really everybody's playing the role here. The Russian government feels that it must stand behind Assad, its ally, so it promised to defend Assad and his regime against Western attacks. The West felt, especially after the use of chemical weapons in April of last year, and then the little American strike that ensued after that it had to do something to show its displeasure with Assad once again using chemical weapons. So the West had to act like it cared, and I think it does. Trump is more concerned than anything, though, with just, looking tough and making good on his tweet. We have to keep in mind here that the Trump administration does not have a strategy. If we keep looking at this administration, hoping to find a strategy, we're forgetting the fact that this is a very different type of president. The United States does not even have a Secretary of State right now. What we have is a president whose main concern every day is making himself look good in the media and trying to stay out of trouble. We have a new national security advisor who's really the wild card in this, John Bolton, because he's a super hawk. His reaction to every situation is to bomb away. And we have a very sober-minded and intelligent defense secretary in Secretary Mattis, who realizes that Trump has to carry out this strike and cooperate with their allies, but doesn't want anything deeper than that. So we have to keep that in mind when we look at things here.
What's your assessment of what impact, if any, this will have on the wider US-Russian relations with the fallout from the chemical attack on a former Russian spy here in the UK, and obviously lots of Russian diplomats being expelled from the US and US diplomats being expelled from Russia? Does that play into this at all?
I frankly think that the chemical attack on the Skripals in England and the Western reaction to that, the fact that the West really has just had enough of these kinds of shenanigans on the part of the Russian government, which of course was behind this attack, was a bigger deal. I think that this attack today was more really of a charade, with the Western powers showing they care, showing that they don't want chemical weapons used in this war, and they treat that as a red line, and the Russians acting, of course, incensed that their ally was attacked.
Okay, Steve Fish, politics professor at the University of California, Berkeley. Really good to get your analysis, your thoughts on this developing story. Thank you.